This is part 15 of The Sunflower by Simon Wiesenthal, and it's the final part before we listen to the synopsis from the experts in both Judaism and Christianity regarding forgiveness. So we continue with the story where Simon visits the dead SS man's mother, and they speak. The old lady's eyes filled with tears. She took the photograph in her hand and gazed at it. Her tears fell on the glass. I once saw in a gallery an old painting of a mother holding a picture of her missing son. Here it had come to life. Ah, she sighed. If you only knew what a fine young fellow our son was. He was always ready to help without being asked. At school he was a model pupil until he joined the Hitler Youth, and that completely altered him. From then on he refused to go to church. She was silent for a while and she recalled the past. The result was a sort of split in the family. My husband didn't talk much, as it was his habit, but I could feel how upset he was. For instance, if he wanted to talk about somebody who had been arrested by the Gestapo, he first looked around to be sure that his own son was not listening. I stood helplessly between my man and my child. Again she sank into reverie. Then the war began and my son came home with the news that he had volunteered for the SS, of course. My husband was horrified. He didn't reproach Karl, but he practically stopped talking to him, right up to the day of his departure. Karl went to war without a single word from his father. During his training, he sent snapshots, but my husband always pushed the photographs aside. He didn't want to look at his son in an SS uniform. Once I told him, we have to live with Hitler, like millions of others. You know what the neighbours think of us. You will have difficulties at the factory. He only answered, I simply can't pretend. They have even taken our son away from us. He said the same thing when Karl left us. He seemed to have written Karl off as his son. I listened intently to the woman and nodded occasionally to encourage her to continue. She couldn't tell me enough. I had previously talked to many Germans and Austrians and learned from them how National Socialism had affected them. Most said that they'd been against it, but were frightened of their neighbours, and their neighbours had likewise been frightened of them. When one added all together all these fears, the result was a frightful accumulation of mistrust. There were many people like Karl's parents. But what about the people who did not need to knuckle under because they had readily accepted the new regime? National Socialism was for them the fulfillment of their dearest wishes. It lifted them out of their insignificance. That it should come to power at the expense of innocent victims did not worry them. They were the winners camp, and they were in the winning camp, and they severed relations with the losers. They expressed the contempt of the strong for the weak, the superman's scorn for the subhuman. I looked at the old lady, who was clearly kind-hearted, a good mother and a good wife. Without doubt she must often have shown sympathy for the oppressed, but the happiness of her own family was of paramount importance to her. There were millions of such families anxious only for peace and quiet in their own little nests. These were the mounting blocks by which the criminals climbed to power and kept it. Should I now tell the old lady the naked truth? Should I tell her what her good boy had done in the name of the leaders? What link was there between me, who might have been among her son's victims, and her, a lonely woman, grieving for the ruin of her family amid the ruins of her people? I saw her grief and I knew my own grief. Was sorrow our common link? Was it possible for grief to be an infinity? I didn't know the answers to these questions. Suddenly the woman resumed her recollections. One day they fetched the Jews away. Among them was our family doctor. According to the propaganda, the Jews were to be resettled. It was said that Hitler was giving them a whole province in which they could live undisturbed among their own people. But later I heard of the brutality with which the SS treated them. My son was in Poland at the time, and people talked of the awful things that were happening there. One day my husband said, "Carl is with the SS over there. Perhaps the positions are reversed and he is now treating our doctor, who formerly treated him." My husband would not say what he meant by that, but I knew he was upset. I was very depressed. Suddenly the old lady looked at me intently. "You're not a German?" she ventured. "No," I replied. "I'm a Jew." She became a little embarrassed. At that time, all the Germans were embarrassed when they met Jews. She hastened to tell me, "In this district, we always lived with Jews in a very peaceful fashion. We are not responsible for their fate." "Yes," said I, "that is what they all say now, and I can well believe it of you. But there are others from whom I won't take it. The question of Germany's guilt may never be settled. But one thing is certain, no German can shrug off the responsibility. Even if it has no personal guilt, he must share the shame of it. As a member of a guilty nation, he cannot simply walk away like a passenger, leaving a tram car whenever he chooses. It is the duty of Germans to find out who was guilty, and the non-guilty must disassociate themselves publicly with the guilty." I felt I had spoken sharply. The lonely widow looked at me sadly. She was not the person with whom one could debate about the sins and the guilt of the Germans. This broken woman, so deeply immersed in grief, was no recipient for my reproaches. I was sorry for her. Perhaps I should not have raised the issue of guilt. "I can't really believe the stories that they tell," she went on. "I can't believe what they say happened to the Jews. During the war there were so many different stories. My husband was the only person who seemed to have known the truth. Some of his workmen had been out east setting up machinery, and when they came back they told of things that even my husband would not believe, although he knew that the party was capable of anything. He did not tell me much of what he had heard. Probably he was afraid I might gossip unthinkingly, and then we get into trouble with the Gestapo, who were already ill-disposed towards us and kept a watchful eye on my husband. But as our Carl was with the SS, they did not molest us. Some of our friends and acquaintances got into trouble. They had been denounced by their best friends. My husband told me once that a Gestapo official had been to see him at the works where the foreigners were employed. He was inquiring into the case of sabotage. He talked to my husband for a long time and finally said, "You were above suspicion, for your son is with the SS." When father came home and told me what had happened, he said bitterly, "They've turned the world upside down. The one thing that has hurt me more than anything else in my life is now my protection." He simply could not understand it. I gazed at the lonely woman sitting sadly with her memories. I formed a picture of how she lived. I knew that from time to time she would take in her arms her son's bundle, his last present, as if it were her son himself. I can well believe what people said. So many dreadful things happened. But one thing is certain, Carl never did any wrong. He was always a decent young man. I miss him so much now that my husband is dead. I thought of the many mothers who were also bereft of their sons. But her son had not lied to me. His home was just as he had described it. Yet the solution of my problem was not a single step nearer. I took my leave without diminishing in any way the poor woman's last surviving consolation, faith in the goodness of her son. Perhaps it was a mistake not to have told her the truth. Perhaps her tears might help to wash away some of the misery of the world. That was not the only thought that occurred to me. I knew there was a little I could say to this mother, and whatever I might have told her about her son's crime, she would have not believed me. She would prefer to think me as a slanderer if I had done so. She kept repeating the words, "He was such a good boy," as if she wished me to confirm it, but that I could not. Would she still have the same opinion if she knew all? In his boyhood, Carl had certainly been a good boy, but a graceless period of his life had turned him into a murderer. My picture of Carl was almost complete. His physical likeness was now established, for in his mother's home I had at last seen his face. I knew all about his childhood, and I knew about the crime he had committed, and was pleased with myself for not having told his mother of the wicked deed. I convinced myself that I had acted rightly. In her present circumstances, to take from her her last possession would probably have also been a crime. Today I sometimes think of the young SS man. Every time I enter a hospital, every time I see a nurse or a man with a head bandage, I recall him. Or when I see a sunflower, and I reflect that people like him are still being born, people who can be indoctrinated with evil. Mankind is ostensibly striving to avert catastrophes. Medical progress gives us hope that one day disease can be conquered. But will we ever be able to prevent the creation of mass murderers? The work in which I am engaged brings me into contact with many known murderers. I hunt them out. I hear witnesses. I give evidence in courts. And I see how murderers behave when accused. At the trial of the Nazis in Stuttgart, only one of the accused showed remorse. He actually confessed to deeds of which there were no witnesses. All the others bitterly disputed the truth. Many of them regretted only one thing, that witnesses had survived to tell the truth. I have often tried to imagine how that young SS man would have behaved if he had been put on trial 25 years later. Would he have spoken in court as he did to me before he died at the Dean's room? Would he openly admit what he had confessed to me on his deathbed? Perhaps the picture that I had formed of him in my mind was kinder than the reality. I never saw him in the camp with a whip in his hand. I saw him only on his deathbed, a man who wanted absolution for his crime. Was he thus an exception? I could find no answer to that question. How could I know if he would have committed further crimes had he survived? I have a fairly detailed knowledge of life stories of many mass murderers. Few of them were born murderers. They had mostly been peasants, manual labourers, clerks, officials, such as one meets in normal everyday life. In their youth they had received religious instruction and no one had previous criminal records. They became murderers, expert murderers, by conviction. It was as if they had taken down their SS uniforms from the wardrobe and replaced them with their consciences as well as with their civilian clothes. I couldn't possibly know their reactions to the first crimes, but I do know that every one of them had subsequently murdered on a wholesale scale. When I recall the insolent replies and mocking grins of many of these accused, it is difficult for me to believe that many repentant young SS men would have also behaved in that way. Yet ought I to have forgiven him? Today the world demands that we forgive and forget the heinous crimes committed against us. It urges that we draw a line and close the account as if nothing had ever happened. We who suffered in those dreadful days, we who cannot obliterate the hell we endured, are forever being advised to keep silent. Well, I kept silent when a young Nazi on his deathbed begged me for to be his confessor. And later, when I met his mother, I again kept silent rather than shatter her illusions about her dead son's inherent goodness. And how many bystanders kept silent, as if they watched Jewish men, women, and children being led to the slaughterhouse of Europe. There are many kinds of silence. Indeed, it can be more eloquent than words, and it can be interpreted in so many ways. Was my silence at the bedside of the dying Nazi right, or was it wrong? This is a profound moral question that challenges the conscience of the reader of this episode, just as much as it once challenged my heart and my mind. There are those who can appreciate my dilemma and so endorse my attitude, and there are others who will be ready to condemn me for refusing to ease the last moment of a repentant murderer. The crux of the matter is, of course, the question of forgiveness. Forgetting is something that time alone takes care of, but forgiveness is an act of violation, and only the sufferer is qualified to make the decision. You who have just read this sad and tragic episode in my life can mentally change places with me and ask yourself the crucial question: what would I have done? Well, that's the end of Simon's story, and the symposium of that story we'll look at next week. But there is a lot to think about. Shabbat Shalom, Mike Fryer.